Before 2012, I didn't actually know that we had multi-reactor facilities. In fact, I didn't even know what that meant. I just thought, yeah, well, that is one nuclear power plant. I didn't realize that it's actually, no, that's like the equivalent of, 4 nuclear power plants in the case of Darlington, or 8 in the case of Pickering and Bruce.
You are listening to TMI for the week of November 6, 2017. Today on TMI, Dave and AJ continue with part 2 of 3, a look at Ontario's best-kept secret, nuclear. It's always that, eh? Nuclear or nuclear.
Yeah, you should say it properly. I'm the idiot who says nuclear.
Nuclear?
Yeah, I say nuclear.
What am I supposed to say?
Nuclear.
Oh. See, this should all be taped. This should be taped, man. Oh, that's good, because what this is all about is developing a new and interesting podcast from people that maybe we haven't heard from for
One last time.
Okay.
I personally think it's awesome that you're doing this podcast. As far as I know, there isn't actually anybody doing this in Canada, at least for the nuclear subject. In the States, they have a few, and some of them are actually very good. Maybe not necessarily in podcast form. I understand that there's a few things that go on down there, but my knowledge
nuclear hot seat.
Yeah, that's a very good example of that. And so up in Canada, we don't have it, and I think part of it is because it takes a lot of effort. And I heard somebody say not too long ago, Toronto is a city of mediocrity, and there aren't many people that tend to put tremendous amounts of effort into a lot of things. And one of the things I really like about this podcast format is when you are looking into the nuclear stuff, you spend so much time reading, like time that you've never thought you could spend before reading about one subject you're reading. There's so much to learn. The thing about reading, and I do read a lot, and I can read faster than I listen, but there's all these times when I'm like, okay, I can't really read right now because I have to clean, or I have to, whatever, I'm on the subway and it's shaking, or on the bus and it's shaking. And so you run into those sorts of situations. Or sometimes you're just like, my eyes feel like they're about to fall out my skull. If there's only, I could listen to something for a while. And so many of the people that are doing this are fantastic speakers. Like Gordon Edwards is a fantastic speaker. I listen to what these people say anytime they speak. And
these people have experience speaking to classrooms and lecture halls.
So they're fantastic orators. And I would hope that they would start to go and hear some more, either on, because now we have a podcast in here in Canada. We don't really have that. Didn't have that before. And on the first episode where you had me on, I thought it was kind of funny how you listed me as an activist. And it's, to me, the reason why I find that funny is because I don't actually really consider myself an activist.
And yet you go to all these meetings, you put a lot of preparation and reading into your speaking, and you're very good at it and energetic, and always from one perspective. And so compared to people who do nothing and don't even read the paper, that's a rabid activist.
Well, the problem about the perspective is their perspectives, first off, you get very little time to present your case. When you have something very complex to present, and when you're going into these hearings and all these other meetings, mainly the hearings, you have CNSC, which is extremely pro-nuclear. You have OPG, which is obviously the proponent, and they're basically, it's up to the public to try to make the case. So it's like this strange reverse onus. Because normally the onus is on the the polluter to make their case about why they should be allowed to go ahead with something. Whereas in the case of nuclear, it's like, no, the public has to try to convince the commission why they shouldn't go ahead with something.
And during the week, the CNSC, at least on social media, is literally just promoting nuclear power.
Yes, they are. Like
Every week. And even during the hearings, if OPG or a pro-nuclear group gets up, the CNSC is tweeting, and now speaking, whatever, from the, Ratchet Makers Association. And when an anti-nuclear person, who's about 80% of the people who get up to present there are actually anti-nuclear, there's no... And speaking now, or I noticed they don't tell you anymore, go to http:// whatever it is .gc and see the live feed. You can't even, they don't want to even post the feed to the hearing.
They do sometimes. I've noticed that they do sometimes announce, like other speakers who are going up sometimes, very sparingly. But they, and as you said during your one intervention, they so often have questions for the pro-nuclear people, but never for the anti-nuclear. And I think
I've been twice.
Yes, you have been twice, at least that I've seen, that I know about. And at the second one, you made the case of, why is it always that they have questions for pro-nuclear, but so rarely for a concerned citizen? And so, if somebody wants to call me an activist, then so be it. That part doesn't really matter to me.
To be honest, my audience on Twitter is rabidly anti-nuclear, and the only way to even get any of them to listen would be if I said, nuclear for nuclear speaking, or I just, if it is an anti-nuclear activist, I don't think my crowd would be.
Gotcha. Okay,
that
makes sense.
A bit of hype.
And during the first interview, something that I should have said, but I didn't, is that I'm not actually an expert in most of the subjects. Probably I'm almost any of the subjects I talked about last time. So like nuclear health. But I did learn a lot of it from the actual experts over the past less than 5 years. So, in my spare time, not really, actively studying the stuff. But yeah, it's something worth noting, just because in case anybody thinks, well, here's this AJ guy saying all these things very authoritatively. Well, no, I'm not actually an expert. This is just me relaying the information that I've seen in the way that I've interpreted it. I could be wrong. I may not be getting all of it, but it sounds logical to me. It seems reasonable to me, and it seems a lot more reasonable than the things that the industry says. So, and another thing that is that with the industry in general, they don't like criticism. They don't like people asking questions. And I personally feel that I'm very open to criticism. Like, I actually want to hear people, what they have to say, just so long as they're willing to be reasonable and to have a dialogue about it. So if somebody says, you're being an idiot, it's like, okay, why am I being an idiot? Back in elementary school, a teacher once said to me, she said, remember, there was a show on at the time, Siskel and Ebert and the movies, and they would always give a thumbs up or a thumbs down at the end of the movie review. And this teacher said, it's not good enough to just give the movie a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So it's not good enough just to say that you like something or that you hate something. You have to say why you don't like it. You have to say why you hate it. And be open to that. And so since then, I've kind of adopted that idea that you have to actually explain why you like something, you don't like something, instead of just making a blanket statement and not being willing to discuss it rationally and with an open mind. I think it's really funny that you added the sound check from the first interview into the actual release. What you put into the finished podcast, you included the sound check, or I'm...
Oh, yeah.
Just
Absolutely.
So another thing that was mentioned in the first interview, and I have a list here, I actually came prepared today. Last time I just sort of showed up and thought, yeah, I'll just answer questions and see what goes. And
Then you realized what a horrible host I am, that I don't have prepared questions for you and
Oh,
have to wing it on your own.
it was fine. I thought it was actually quite fun, and I'm hoping more people will come in and do this because it's more like just like a social get together than some being grilled type thing. It's very casual, very relaxed. But one of the things
If this was an office that we were having the podcast in, it would feel different. I think it would generate a different, like with that buzzsaw in the background. I mean, it all creates a kind of,
that's what that is.
I don't know what it is.
Construction, at any rate.
But right with plants, and you're not drinking my coffee, but with coffees and plants and stuff, is a different thing going on than if they're with file cabinets or.
And you have a finite time. Like this is also nice because there's not really a set limit. It's not as though you have 6 minutes to present this and that's all you get, and less restrictions on it. So that's another nice thing.
And it's not a morning zoo format exactly.
There was some talk about like how reactors are built in clusters here in Ontario, and that and I mean before 2012 I didn't actually know that we had multi-reactor facilities. In fact, I didn't even know what that meant. Like I just thought, yeah, well that is one nuclear power plant. I didn't realize that it's actually that's like the equivalent of 4 nuclear power plants in the case of Darlington, or 8 in the case of Pickering and Bruce. So that was something that kind of surprised me. And what makes that rather significant is in the case of Fukushima, they had, 6 reactors at Fukushima Daiichi, and 3 of them failed. So 3 of them had so one of them totally failed, and that caused a cascading failure onto 2 more. But what's very significant about that is that they had secondary safety systems at each of the 6 reactors. So each reactor had their own separate vacuum building, like it was like its own entirely self-contained thing. They just happened to be in very, very close proximity. Whereas here in Ontario, we're using this really terrible multi-reactor, like shared containment design. So at Pickering, where they have 8 reactors, they have only 1 vacuum building. At, Darlington, they have 4 reactors, only 1 vacuum building. And the 1 vacuum building is okay for, 1 reactor, assuming that basically the pathways going from the vacuum building to the specific reactor building don't have any problems with it. Because now you also have to factor in the distance and that. So that's one other potential point of failure. But now you compound it by, okay, what if there's 2 reactors that fail? Well, suddenly it can't contain that at all. And these reactors do release, according to one of the interveners at the last hearing, the 2015 Darlington hearing, stated that they release 2% of their load per hour. So they lose 2% of the containment per hour. So that's 48% per day. Is what's potentially going to be leaking out in the event of some really big deal. And they leak stuff not only...
when you say that, that's a 50-ton core. So 2% of a 50-ton core is...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I see. Okay, yeah, I should actually... You're right. I should clarify. That's actually... I'm referring to what's in the air around it. Sorry, hit that thing and made a noise. It's actually what's in the air around it. So not necessarily like the hard particles, like the physical stuff, but like the airborne.
Okay, so in a nuclear accident, if there was a fuel incident, there would be vapors released into the secondary containment. And that even though there's a vacuum building to suck that into a place they can store it or for a while, they still lose some of that to the environment. So it's not containable.
No, and...
I want to back up a bit.
Oh, yeah,
you said Fukushima. So 6 reactors at Fukushima, 3 of them had meltdowns. The fact is that there were 4 of one type, BWRs, and the 2 other reactors were newer designed reactors, and they were higher than the other ones. So not only were they of newer and better design, but they were actually higher, and so not as impacted by the tsunami wave, and perhaps protected more. So of the BWRs at Fukushima, there were problems at all 4 reactors. The 3 meltdowns, but there was problems with an explosion at reactor 4 due to a shared exhaust pathway. Reactor 3 and 4 shared the same smokestack, and when there was the fuel accident at reactor 3, some of the hydrogen, which usually would have been vented by the same smoke system, was damaged in the earthquake, and so some of the hydrogen from reactor 3 got into reactor 4 building, and that's what blew up reactor 4. So there are shared systems in the BWRs. 4 out of 4 of the reactors of the BWR Mark I type experience catastrophic failure. So it's a shit show. No matter where you look at it. Anyway.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I've barely done any studying on the international reactors. Like, my focus has mainly been on Darlington and Pickering because they're so close. Like, they are really, really, really close. Like, people in Toronto don't realize this, like, just how close these things. In fact, even people in Durham don't realize how insanely close these things are. Because
most people in Ontario think there's 3 nuclear reactors in Ontario, as opposed to the 20 plus.
Yeah, and it seems like most people don't even realize, like, a reactor is the equivalent of a whole gigantic power plant. Like, it's that was my own case, and talking to other people, they're like, well, how does that work, and having to explain it to people. But
not to sidetrack you too much, but there's a big, in the Ontario nuclear industry, there's a big push on for the small modular reactors. Have you been looking into that?
So stupid.
So
stupid.
You don't even have economy of scale, which barely serves the large size reactors well. Building tiny little reactors is just another sandbox for suit dummies in pursuit of funding.
And it's never been done. Like, as far as I know, there's never actually been one that has been made. And even if they were to make one, it doesn't make any sense to try to make these things.
We still have nuclear waste.
Exactly.
Well, the reason why they build them is 2, and this is incredible. 1, so they can build them closer to cities. And 2, they actually avoid the conventional containment, which was supposed to be impervious to a direct strike by an airliner. So now you've got an SMR, no conventional containment. They're going to put them close to cities, and we're going to have waste management trucks, I assume, ubiquitous, just like garbage trucks carrying nuclear waste around. This is the vision they have. And the reason why they would locate them close to cities is they get to have to pull less wire.
So this airplane thing is something that is worth noting, because in the case of Darlington, there's a laughable thing that they call a containment. It's a terrible designed jumble of concrete slabs. That's like the idea of a containment. If you're trying to contain something, you want it to be as spherical as possible. If you think of trying to contain anything, like Roman architecture, you'll see it's typically like arches. It's always very curved. If you look at almost every reactor around the world, their containment is in some sort of, usually more like cylindrical, but it's much closer to a sphere. Then all the pressure is going to be distributed evenly. In this case, it's in this jumble of concrete slabs with all these odd, strange pockets. So there's a lot of room for things to break open. It's not, and not only that, but the size of it is far, far, far too small, and it's also extremely leaky. So it's releasing a lot of stuff just through its own bad design. So that's the first part of it. The second part of that is there's a lot of things that you should have inside that containment, quote unquote containment, as it's not even really containment, just it's a mess. But then outside of that, on top of that, so again, outside of that, you now have the steam generators, they are outside containment. They are above that. The roof above that isn't any and it isn't any different than what you'd find on the roof of like a Home Depot. It's just a standard roof. Like anything can puncture that, go through it. So if something was to come down, like an airplane, take out one of those steam generators, then you're going to have an extreme problem.
You're going to have an explosion that involves pressure, but also that's the coolant that helps cool the actual reactors. Steam-generated fluid that runs through the steam generators is part of the coolant circuit.
The intervention by Sunil Najawan at the 2015 Darlington hearing focused a lot on that and what a terrible, terrible, terrible design that is. Like it's something that I personally never knew about until then. And I mean, most people don't know about it all, but if you get somebody that wants you to understand a problem, they are going to typically be better at explaining it than somebody that's trying to hide a problem. They usually just talk around the issue or dance around the issue and try to distract you. I think I mentioned before about the different diversionary tactics that they tend to use of, oh, let's just change the subject. Hey, look over there. What's that? So before we mentioned a few times the word refurbishment, and something that's worth noting is that it's not really refurbishment, it's more of a rebuild. So I personally try to make a point of always using the word rebuild instead of refurbish, because when you think of refurbish, it's usually like, oh yeah, tweak this, alter this here and here, make sure this is tightened and sufficient. There you go. That's the end of it. With a rebuild, it's an extremely expensive process. We're taking pretty much the whole thing apart. So just that clarification that I personally prefer to use the term rebuild instead of refurbish.
There were a bunch of articles a few years ago about crumbling and decaying concrete at Canadian nuclear facilities. That's not really addressed in the rebuild. They're just changing the internal parts.
Exactly.
Lucky we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, our concrete is somehow different.
Mm-hmm.
No, not really. Another term is the term repository. That is their term. They refer to their deep underground dump. They refer to that as a repository. Now, if you think of a library, a book is a repository. If you think of other types of repositories where you can put something and retrieve it, I think that's the definition of a repository. But in the case of this, they're planning to put it there and then abandon it. So essentially, that is a dump. And I think I don't know who came up with that realization initially. The first person I heard it say that was Gordon Edwards of ccnr.org. So I think it's better for people in general, instead of to say the word repository, to say dump.
This is all Orwellian doublespeak that's used as PR.
Yeah. And I think it needs to, when people are talking about it, I think they need to use the words to describe what it actually is. Obviously, the industry won't, because they're trying to put their own positive spin on it. But for people that are talking about it in general, you should refer to it as a dump. So that's something I'm myself trying to be more conscientious of, making sure that I'll say, yeah, they call it this, but it's actually a dump. You had an interview with Helen Caldicott, which was amazing. When I first started getting into this and reading about it, there was always this difficulty of who do you trust, how can you trust them, whatever. And people with, questionable job titles, and you're like, well, what does that mean in English? And then suddenly here's this Helen Caldicott who she's like, I'm a medical doctor. It's like, okay, well, I know what that is. Let's hear what the medical doctor has to say. And there's this video on YouTube. It's 9 minutes and 53 seconds long. The title of this video is Japan Nuclear Crisis, The Dangers of Radiation, Dr. Helen Caldicott, globalresearch.ca. And she gives a talk. This is just a few days after the Fukushima disaster began. And I think it's important that we say began, because these things start, but they don't really end, and it's still very much an ongoing disaster. It's still a major thing in Japan that isn't really getting covered here. And I want to talk also about your interview with Dennis Riches, but it's still like on everybody's minds in Japan, but we're just not hearing about it so much in North America, mainly because of who controls the media in North America, but that's another issue.
Well, it's interesting, the character assassination campaign against Dr. Helen Caldicott's alive on a daily basis. Chris Busby is another target of constant criticism. Really ridiculous. I mean, he's a professor, he's produced all kinds of papers, he's set up organizations, and he presents. He's even been involved in legal cases in the UK on radiation poisoning. It's just incredible how important it is to use ad hominem character assassination when there's no other tools at your disposal.
It's one of their tactics. It's just this oh, you don't understand this. Oh, you're not educated enough. Like these, you're wrong, and not willing to have a dialogue.
Well, those are all logical fallacies. So, and they resort to straw man and any one of 27 different actual types of logical fallacy, in the absence of any actual real criticism. In the case of Busby, I think a friend of his was thinking about selling some kind of supplement that blocked cesium uptake, and just like potassium iodide blocks iodine uptake. And this is to this day, after 6 years, the main criticism of Busby was he was profiting off vitamins.
And I've heard people...
It's ridiculous. And if you read any of his papers or movies or interviews, you know right away when you're hearing the truth. And one of the ways you know when you're hearing the truth is it's not good news. That's what's become almost a marker for the truth for me.
Well, and the criticism of Helen Caldicott, who, by the way, the organization that she helped start, I mean, it won a Nobel Prize.
Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Thank you. I couldn't remember the name.
She was also instrumental in helping Reagan and Trudeau at the time push their anti-nuclear arms reduction treaties in the early 80s. I used to listen to her radio show, which ended about 2 years ago, and every Saturday I would not miss an episode. She had, and her website, If You Love This Planet, has all the archived interviews, and if you look through those interviews, the names in those interviews is a who's who of the environmental anti-nuclear movement.
I'm going to have to listen to that. I wasn't even aware of it until just now. The one thing that I've heard, the criticism I've heard so many times about her, and it's a stupid thing to criticize, is I've heard people say, oh, well, she's just trying to sell books. And it's like, no, I mean, you don't live forever. You have only so much time to do things. She has put all of her words into the books. I don't even really think she cares about making money on the books.
How many books have the pro-nuclear people written?
Well,
if they've written a lot, then they did it just to sell books. And if they haven't written any, then they don't know what they're talking about. So either way.
Listen on our webpage, on iTunes, or wherever you find podcasts. For links and show notes, visit tmi.twxnet.com.
Last week, OPG released a report about its financial plans for the next year, and some whopping amount, which you should know.
$500 million over budget, that one, or?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Well, it was mentioned in the hearings. There was a hearing about a week ago, and OPG was presenting its annual expenditure, and a ridiculous amount of money was just nuclear waste on an annual basis. And we all can't figure out why electricity is so expensive in Ontario. It's surely got to be wind. You can't be, Ernie Eves or any other premier that's ever been.
Yeah. And I go to these meetings called DNHC, Durham Nuclear Health Committee. They take place in Durham region. And they invite people from Toronto to go, so pretty much anyone can go. But they had somebody ask the question one time, okay, well, how much is it going to cost to deal with this waste issue? And this OPG guy stood up and said, oh, well, we have a budget of this many billions of dollars, and therefore that's what it's going to cost. And I was like, okay, so that works out to how many dollars per year for the lifespan of these isotopes? So you think you can handle that many tons of it for this many dollars per year for the next hundreds of thousands of years? I don't know. So you run into these goofy, outlandish statements. There was one person at the 2012 Darlington hearing who said, well, what is the cost of it? And they just simply wouldn't even answer the question. They wouldn't even try to answer the question. So I thought it was funny to hear them say at this one, what's effectively a community, well, it's a political advisory committee meeting where they're just saying that openly. This is what we actually think. And then the public can hear it and kind of scratch their heads like, how does that make any sense at all for the next hundreds of thousands of years?
Well, I just love how he was confident that whatever he was allocated in the budget would be enough.
I know. And he was
up until they need more money, and then it was woefully irresponsible to underfund it. So
he was so confident with it too, which is another thing that to me, like yourself, I'm very much into comedy, and one of the funniest things for me is just unfounded confidence. Like when somebody is just so comically, I don't know if you've seen the cartoon Invader Zim, but it's this little Urkin invader named Zim, and from another planet, and he decides he's going to conquer Earth, but he's just so bad at it. But he thinks he is the best invader that the Urkin Armada has ever had.
Kind of like Pinky in the Brain. He's pretty self-assured.
But it's usually Pinky that screws everything up, not so much the brain.
But, the brain...
Oh, he's very confident,
If he was a little smart, he'd realize his sidekick is harming him. Or he'd put two and two together and realize that they never get any closer to their goal.
On the waste issue, something that I think people need to be aware of is that there's a plan to ship some extremely nasty stuff from Chalk River down to, I think it's like Georgia or something, somewhere in...
Savannah is the site that they send almost all countries' nuclear waste is all being now stockpiled at Savannah River. Stuff from Britain, stuff from Japan, stuff from all over the world is now being, like, as if it was a commodity they were stockpiling.
What's particularly disturbing about this is that they are planning to ship extremely nasty stuff, like the most toxic, deadly stuff that humanity has ever created in liquid form.
On the highway.
On public roads and bridges that have not been rated for, are they capable of, like, in containers that aren't even designed to hold liquids. But what's really nerve-wracking about what they're trying to ship across is that this is going to go, and I mean the route is up for speculation, but it could go through the bridge to the States near Kingston. It could go the one near, it could go over the Peace Bridge, like near Niagara.
There's a name for that convoy. I can't remember what it is.
Yeah, it's coming from what they call the FIST, FISST or something, and it's been there for decades and decades and decades, and now for some reason, instead of solidifying it, instead of downblending it, instead of doing all these other things that they could be doing, they're just trying to ship it in its current raw, extraordinarily, extremely toxic form across public roads and bridges. If they were to have the smallest, tiniest, most minuscule drop of that come out, that would be an ecological catastrophe. And let alone a full normal spill of what you'd see of something being spilled on the highway. Normally something gets spilled on the highway, it's often not a big deal as long as it's not some, dangerous substance. But this is beyond a dangerous substance. Like, I don't even know who they're going to be able to bring in to try to contain it. Like, how are they, like, what happens if it gets into the water? What if it happens on a rainy day? What happens if, like, there's all these possibilities that make it a terrible idea. They should not do it. That's the simplest thing, that they should not do it this way. One note on the subject of waste and what to do with it. Like, you suggested having everything in one place. One that I've heard from Gordon Edwards many times has been this concept of rolling stewardship. So the idea is that rather than just trying to put it in one place and just abandon it there, that every, let's say, 20 to 30 years, so once per generation, you have this repackaging of the waste. So because these containers don't last forever, so you repackage it and you train people how to do that, and that becomes their lives. And you do it basically on the surface where it's easily retrievable, far away from any water supplies or major municipal areas. They gave a pamphlet, and this was discussed at the 2012 Darlington hearing. They sent it around to however many households in Durham. Like, they distributed tens of thousands of copies of this, if I remember correctly, and about what to do in the event of disaster in Durham region. It's like, okay, so make sure that you have your this and this. The funny thing is about all this emergency preparedness stuff in this guidebook. Never once did the word nuclear appear. It covered all kinds of subjects, but nothing about the elephant in the room, these gargantuan nuclear power plants, which just I find amazing.
I remember hearing that at that hearing. Yeah, that's just depressing. In a case of a nuclear accident, priority one is the quick dissemination of accurate information to the public. As soon as you do that, everybody's going to want to leave. If everybody's trying to leave at the same time, try take a trip out to Durham region at a normal rush hour, let alone a nuclear accident. And you start to realize that this whole thing is a house of cards. Or at that same hearing or a hearing after it, the fire marshal pointed out, we can't shelter in place in Canada. We can't duct tape a house sealed, airtight. Like, not only do you need fresh air to breathe, your furnace and hot water tank in a country that gets to negative 35 once in a while can't operate. It's a fire violation to operate those devices without 2 pipes of 3 inches each feeding gas-powered devices.
There was there's a guy who's attended as an observer of these DNHC meetings in Durham several times, and he started off as, okay, the industry is speaking in ways that make sense to me, and therefore I'm more sympathetic to what the industry is saying because they're speaking, in ways that I'm used to communicating. They speak more like I speak, so therefore I'm trusting them more. And then somebody raised the issue of evacuation, and he was like, well, hold on, because when I'm trying to leave my home where I live, on a normal day, it takes like 5 minutes just to get out of the driveway. You want to edit that out?
Oh, no, that's a keeper. That's what you get for living near a nuclear power plant.
Recovering from my first cold since 2008. So yeah, he said, when you're normally trying to get out of, his driveway, it takes him like 5 minutes during rush hour to get out of the driveway. It's like this multi-unit place. And he said, if this was a disaster, if everybody was going on the road, I wouldn't be able to get out at all. And the reason is because there would be so many crashes. Like on a good day, there are crashes, and you can't get out onto the road. He talked about that. He said one time there was a crash on the road, and he actually could not get out of the driveway. They were stuck in there. We saw that after the ice storm, where there were countless people who just simply could not get out, especially people that had mobility issues. So,
well, the leader of the free world, the planet's example, We saw how they couldn't get gas. And this is with a week of warning. In a nuclear accident, there is no week of warning. And coordinating gas stations, keeping them open, keeping employees at the gas station, keeping the guys who drive the trucks. Imagine driving a truck full of fuel into a nuclear accident for your, like, whatever it is they're getting paid. It ain't happening. None of this makes any sense. Just like the fallacy of containment, that whole idea, everybody thinks about containment means keeping the nuclear materials inside the plant. What about keeping bombs or planes out of the plant? It's a two-way barrier at containment.
One thing I've noticed is that as people start to think about it from different perspectives, because everybody has their own world that they live in. Everybody has their own people, their own connection, their own knowledge, their own history, their own background. Eventually, people that are almost indifferent to nuclear, they'll hear something that to them they find very upsetting or very concerning when they realize this is all, like as you said, a house of cards. This is all just a charade. Like for me, it was that talk by Mark Matson of Lake Ontario Waterkeeper in 2012, where I first heard about how they are dumping radioactive poison into Lake Ontario. 15-minute and 10-second YouTube video. And I strongly encourage everybody to check it out. The title of it is Hazards of Fukushima Damage to Lake Ontario. It is absolutely worth watching. 15 minutes of just gold. It's really, really good. So I highly recommend checking that out. So you talked about the total inadequacy of the buildings in Ontario in terms of our buildings are not designed like they are in other countries. Like if we were to have a disaster here, we could not, as they say, shelter in place. If you were to say the average person, like most people don't even know what that means. When the industry says that, what they're referring to is you just lock yourself in your home and don't go out for whatever period of time. And our buildings are not designed to keep everything out the way that, like the vast overwhelming majority of buildings in Ontario are not designed that way.
And the ones that are considered sick buildings. Office buildings that don't have air exchange are a union issue. They're unhealthy. It's a thing.
I believe it. The first person I heard raise that was Teresa McLenaghan of CELA. She is the foremost expert of Canadian Environmental Law Association. She's the foremost expert on nuclear emergency planning in Ontario. And one thing I would suggest is that if you can't get her as a guest on the show, because again, she's extremely busy, to consider getting Durham Nuclear Awareness. Their main focus for the past, I don't know how many years, but it's been nuclear emergency planning, and they've become quite good at it. Their main speaker that speaks at almost all of their events is Janet McNeil. So I think it would be a good thing to have her on to give a talk. They have a website, durhamnuclearawareness.com, that also links to their other social media pages. I guess their Facebook and Twitter and whatever else they're doing. But with a lot of these groups, you kind of want to get on their mailing lists. So like I mentioned, Durham Nuclear Awareness, they have a mailing list, so you can get on that. But also, Gordon Edwards has an amazing mailing list, and his essays are fantastic on almost every subject that he puts out, and he writes everything in a way that anybody can understand it. So he's not talking over your head. He's not patronizing you. He's presenting it like as clearly as anybody can, to try to get you to understand the problem, because he wants you to understand the problem. He wants to understand why this is a big deal.
One of his videos that I post a lot on Twitter is how I became an anti-nuclear activist.
Yes,
which is a favorite.
It's a really good one. I was actually going to suggest that same video, that everybody go check it out. It's really good. And another mailing list obviously would be Ontario Clean Air Alliance, and there's some other ones as well. We talked about the weird security presence at these hearings. And there's a combination of police security and private security. So they have the police security are actually they've been hired to be there. So you can actually rent, like you can go to like a police organization and basically say, we're having a big event. We want to have some police security there. And police is often more expensive to hire, but the main goal is that they have a lot of powers that the private security don't. So they can actually arrest you. They have a lot of things, but part of the reason why the police are more willing to do so is because it's to ensure that that order is maintained, that there's not nobody's rights are being violated, that private security isn't overstepping their bounds.
Is it not also that most of the experts in the country are assembled under one roof, and actually, if something did happen at one of these hearings, it would actually impact the functionality and ability to respond of the nuclear industry in our country? It's actually in our nation's interest to protect the people in that room.
But the strange thing is I've been to so many other meetings, with the exception of obviously the big people, so like the premiers and the prime minister. Obviously
they're useless. We're talking about nuclear experts,
Yes.
people licensed to operate nuclear plants. There's not a lot of them. You wouldn't want to lose half of them in one go.
But I have been to some other events where there's been basically no security. You can just go up to anyone and cause all kinds of problems. But no, it's very strange. I don't understand why it is the way that it is at these hearings. I mean, it's just bizarre. And they have these metal detectors at the entrances. And the first time I went there, I didn't know that was going to be there. So I showed up, and suddenly there's this security guard with a metal detector. And I was just like, okay, that's good for metal. And I asked him, what does this, almost as a joke? I mean, sometimes it's fun just to get in people's heads, but I said, does that check for like radioisotopes as well? And he looks at it, and he looks at it, and he looks at me with kind of concern and suspicion. And he's like, no.
Should it?
So it was just like, okay, I just asking, just curious.
Hammer drilling, courtesy of my neighbors.
That's okay. And you said before, and I really wanted to mention this. You said about having the hearings in the middle of nowhere, and
I'm calling some area where you live the middle of nowhere. I get that pisses off a lot of people from Durham region, but I've had to drive out there, and you go to this tiny little church, and somebody said, "Oh, it's like a funeral for nuclear," because it was at a church. I thought that was kind of funny, but. It's like, and I say this all the time, what if they held it at the Sky Dome, where most of the inhabitants and ratepayers of Ontario are? Like, what if you held it at Kensington Market? How many million people would show up for this stuff? I mean, this is clearly a strategy that they do on purpose. Half the hearings they hold in Ottawa. So somebody like me, I'd have to drive 5 hours one way just to get there. This is done on purpose.
Well, the Ottawa part of the hearing is, or maybe it's Gatineau, might be Gatineau, same thing, where they have, it's typically just the industry talking to CNSC and back. That's usually how that part of it goes. It's not really open for the general public. But the public side, like it's in that case, for Darlington, it's in Darlington plant, it's in what used to be Darlington Township. And now that's Darlington Township was amalgamated with Clark Township to form a portmanteau of Clark and Darlington, so they called it Clarington, so that's where the name came from. So you go out to Curtis, which is like this, and not only Curtis, but like this way south bizarre place in Curtis that's difficult to get to, totally middle of nowhere. But those would be the people, and I think that would be the closest community center-ish thing to the plant, but I can understand that's why they have it there, because those are the people who are geographically most closely affected. However, I wholeheartedly agree that they should definitely have it in more than that one spot, because the majority of the population that would likely be affected by a disaster at Darlington would be much further afield. Because realistically, the disaster is not going to be contained to within the plant boundaries. It's going to go much further out, as we saw in the case of
every accident that's ever happened.
Yeah, and what people in Toronto don't realize is just how close these plants are. The radius around Chernobyl has a 30-kilometer exclusion zone. So for the next however many hundreds of years, no human being will live within 30 kilometers of that damaged, destroyed reactor. That doesn't mean that's where all the radioactivity stopped. I mean, it went all over the place. But it's that 30-kilometer radius. Now, if you think about that, Pickering Nuclear Power Plant, or Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, is 30 kilometers from downtown Toronto. So it's within a 30-kilometer radius of downtown Toronto is Pickering Nuclear Generating Station. And then Darlington is another 30 kilometers past that. So it's 60-kilometer radius. But as we saw with Fukushima, they found areas that were 100 kilometers away that were extremely, extremely, extremely contaminated.
And comparing kilometers to miles, right after the nuclear accident at Fukushima, the U.S. government warned its citizens not to go within 90 miles.
Find our shows, show notes, and contact information at tmi.twxnet.com.
The American Thyroid Association, their website is thyroid.org. They came up with, and I'm looking for it in my notes, the title of this page. So if you do a search for questions and answers about potassium iodide, and then in brackets they have Ki, which is the elemental symbols for it. It's on thyroid.org, the American Thyroid Association. They talk about how they recommend that potassium iodide pills are pre-distributed to everybody within at least 50 miles. And I'm a metric person, so I had to do the conversion. That's 80 kilometers. So they're saying that everybody within 50 miles of a nuclear reactor should have potassium iodide pills in their homes, in their businesses, ready to go at all times.
Well, people in Toronto have never heard of Ki.
Yeah.
And forget Darlington and Pickering. We're downwind from Bruce. Actually, downwind from Bruce. And across the lake, there are 3 major power plants with more than 3 reactors. One of them is a Fukushima-style BWR at James A. Fitzpatrick. So, I mean, and I'm not even including any nuclear reactors on Lake Erie, which we're also downwind from. So we are literally surrounded in every direction by nuclear power plants here. Population of 5.5 million people, and not one of us has ever heard of Ki, ever.
And when I was a kid, we were given, as mentioned in the last interview, we were given this form to take home for a parent or guardian to sign, saying that you give the school permission to administer potassium iodide tablets to your child in the event of a nuclear disaster. And so, I mean, growing up in Durham, I was aware of that. But, you know, in Toronto, like, nobody even knows what it is or what it does. Every study, every test that they've done on it has shown that this is actually quite effective. As long, and this is very important, as long as you take it before exposure. So you have to you already have this. You can't, be running around trying to find your potassium iodide pills. You have to be ready with it before your exposure.
Even the Ki is a fallacy because how many nuclear accidents only emit iodine?
Yes, and you're definitely right. I should make a note about that because that's another thing to touch on.
Yeah, what about the cesium? What about the plutonium? What about the uranium? What about the neptunium? What about the, all kinds of daughter products. There's 211 poisons that come with spent nuclear fuel that would be ejected in a fuel accident. Taking these pills and being assured that your kids are safe against thyroid cancer is just another bit of theater, really.
Well, and the thing is that it's only one thing, and it protects only one thing. So the potassium iodide will protect your thyroid, which is going to be one of the most sensitive things, but it's definitely not the only one. It's definitely not necessary. Well, it's a serious issue. You should have it. You should have potassium iodide. It's only just one part of a much grander scheme. What you really have to do in a nuclear disaster is get away from it. Go as far away as you possibly can. The way that they used to distribute potassium iodide is you had to go, there were only 5 pharmacies that had it. So you had to go, and where were these 5 pharmacies? 3 of them were right beside Pickering, and 2 were right beside Darlington. So you had to go into the potential plume to get them in the event of an emergency. They were not pre-distributed. That just happened in the past few years. And currently they have been pre-distributed to within 10 kilometers. But as I said a few minutes ago, American Thyroid Association says it should be within 80 kilometers, 50 miles, over 80 kilometers, should have them pre-distributed. If you are in Toronto, basically anywhere in Toronto, in fact, I think even parts of Mississauga, certainly parts of York Region and Northumberland County as well, can do this at any time. There's a website you should go to get them. They will ship them for free. It costs nothing to you other than the minute it takes of your time to go do this. It's a website with a really stupid domain name. The website is, I'll give you the whole address. It's preparetobesafe.ca/order. It's a really stupid domain name because nobody actually prepares to be safe. You prepare for catastrophe. So when they were first presenting that as a thing that they were planning to introduce was this Prepare to Be Safe website, I said to them, nobody prepares to be safe. They prepare for catastrophe. You should change it to preparefocatastrophe.ca. They said, we'll take that under advisement, and they never actually went through with it.
Maybe they meant to pause. Prepare to be safe.
Yeah, such a stupid domain.
To be safe.
Yeah.
Prepare.
Yeah, they could have used commas, perhaps. Anyway, so yeah, you can go there, and if you're within 50 kilometers of in fact, you can just go there anyway. Just punch in your postal code, and they'll say, yeah, you're eligible. Basically, if you live in Toronto, you can do that right now. If you're in York Region, you can do that right now. If you're anywhere in Durham, of course, you can do that. Probably most of Northumberland, or at least parts of Northumberland County, you can do that. Maybe even Peel Region. I think Mississauga may be eligible as well. Parts, maybe like eastern parts of Mississauga. Just go to that website, preparetobesafe.ca/order, type in your postal code. They'll say, yeah, okay, we'll now ship it for free. Just punch in your address, and they'll mail these potassium iodide pills to you for free, no cost to you. And it's the polluter that's paying for it, which of course we're paying for through our tax dollars, but you should have these things. Somebody I know was in Poland at the time of Chernobyl, and what's quite remarkable about that is, and this is mentioned in that one American Thyroid Association article. Again, the title of the article is Questions and Answers About Potassium Iodide. It's on thyroid.org. They were in Poland, and they were taken to a school, and they waited in this very, very long line to take a pill, and it was a potassium iodide pill. So they took it, and according to the American Thyroid Association, people who are given potassium iodide in Poland have basically normal thyroids compared to people who were just across the border in Ukraine. So you could really just look at that border, that dividing line, and that was a very striking difference between generally normal thyroids and, oh boy, this is very, very bad. So it has actually been tested and proven that this is something that everybody should have. Now, it's not going to protect you from everything. That's just one thing. There's all kinds of other stuff you have to worry about. But you kind of got to protect your thyroid. So you mentioned the cesium-137, and here's something that blew my mind. And I never thought about this. I think it might have been in a... where did I first read about it? I think it might have been in a in a No Nukes News newsletter, Ontario Clean Air Alliance's No Nukes News newsletter. They had a it turns out, and I never thought about this, but cesium-137 doesn't exist in nature. As far as we know, it doesn't exist anywhere in the universe. It is a fission product. And when you look at imported foodstuffs, so you'll typically see it most often in meat because things bioaccumulate through the food chain. It talks about the quantity of cesium-137 that's being imported in that. And what I find so phenomenal about that is that this didn't exist until about 72 years ago. This is a new thing on the planet. Now it's just being written like almost summarily in these documents of, oh yes, our fish contains this much cesium-137. And I just find that so astonishing. So you mentioned cesium-137. I had to mention that because it just blows my mind.
It's a man-made fission product that's only available when released by a nuclear accident.
Or a nuclear bomb, and so the fission process in general.
Yeah. What's the name of the? I always forget this. Epothecene, is that the name of our current geological era? And that
Anthropocene. I think it was start with and. No, I think there's another one that we've entered into as well because we're now into the extreme development era. But yeah, I think you're right. We did enter into a new one like around the time of the Industrial Revolution.
And it's marked by a layer of man-made fission products. Just like the iridium layer can be found in the dinosaur record, we now have this layer deposited by nuclear activity that is markable and defines a geological era as a layer.
When they look at like ice core samples, they find, okay, well, we can trace back, oh, there's obviously a drought, or here's some weird crazy event took place. And then you get up to these upper layers, and it just gets very, very dirty and messy, and all from one species. It's not very fun to think about, but
the plastic, that's just another indicator. There's little plastic beads that show up on every shoreline. The chasm of plastic in the middle of the Pacific. All kinds of evidences of our
the Great Pacific, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or whatever they call it, which is just this. People should Google that just to get a sense of what we have done as a species that is just destroying our oceans.
Well, the interesting thing about bringing up examples like this are you juxtapose that against the confidence so many people have, because these guys are all in white smocks and have receding hairlines. The trust we put in them with nuclear, and they're just deferring all these decisions to the nuclear class, when all you have to do is just look at almost any other aspect of human behavior to see how poorly managed and how unwise our actions are.
DNHC, Durham Nuclear Health Committee, as I said, it operates like a nuclear power fan club. That's not what they're supposed to be. They are not supposed to be, glorifying everything that the nuclear industry does, but that's what they do. And like the industry that they just revere, they are mortified of scrutiny. DNHC does not want their minutes published, they don't want detailed minutes published for their meetings. They don't want their meetings recorded, so they don't want people to be able to watch these meetings and see what goes on there. And they really, truly do not want people to attend, especially the politicians whom they advise. They don't want even the people they're supposed to be advising to attend their meetings. So I think it would be a lot of fun to get all kinds of people to show up at their January nuclear emergency preparedness meeting to just watch them squirm. Ask questions that you know will make them uncomfortable. Things like, what do I do? Like, where do I go? Just be creative. Come up with your own questions and ask them, and just watch these people squirm. They are not doing their jobs. In my opinion, they are an embarrassment to the people of Durham region and just to taxpayers in general. And we're all paying, if you live in Ontario, your taxes are contributing to their salaries. And I encourage you to look on the Sunshine List to see just how much these people are getting made. It's, in my opinion, it's very surprising. So if that's another reason why I would really suggest that people come to this upcoming January meeting, that would be one of them, just to watch these people squirm.
Follow us on Twitter, rate and review the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer from Toronto.
And I'm AJ, the IT professional from Ontario.